Going to start recording. As you heard, I'm going to start recording. We're only going to record the talk. We're not going to record the Q&A, so you can feel free to intervene as you like. You will not be recorded. But because some people, because of time zone differences, have asked if we can record the talk, we've decided that we're going to make that available after the seminar. So welcome everybody to the first Vegan Studies Network Research Seminar. I am thrilled that we have set up this new way of talking about veganism. And in this series, we're going to have speakers introduce recently published books on veganism from different disciplines. So it's going to be very rich and very exciting. There's going to be 6 seminars in total, roughly on the last Wednesday of each month until June. And all of them are at 5 p.m. Central European time, not summer time, as I mistakenly wrote in some of the ads, which is 4 p.m. London time. And we're going to talk the speakers are going to talk for approximately 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a 40 minutes discussion. So there will be plenty of opportunities to make comments or ask questions of the speakers. The seminars are organized by the Vegan Studies Network. If you don't know us, we are a recently set up academic network. We were set up in 2018, and the goal is to put together researchers who do research, teaching, and public engagement on all questions related to veganism, which we understand very broadly as the motivations, the possibilities, the implications, and the challenges of a world without animal exploitation. So we're an international network, we're a multidisciplinary network, as this seminar series will show. And the aim is to really broaden the possibility of understanding what veganism is, since in many ways, both as a social, ethical, and practical phenomenon, is certainly growing. So this is all I wanted to say by way of introduction. Again, very happy that there is so much interest here. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, who is also one of our members, Emelia Quinn. Emelia Quinn is Assistant Professor of World Literatures and Environmental Humanities at the University of Amsterdam. Her work establishes the field of vegan theory and its intersections with queer theory, animal studies, ecocentrism, and post-colonial studies. Her monograph, Reading Veganism, The Monstrous Vegan 1818 to Present, which we're going to hear about today, was published in 2021 with Oxford University Press. Emelia is also the co-editor of Thinking Veganism in Literature and Culture Towards a Vegan Theory, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018, and of the forthcoming Edinburgh Companion to Vegan Literary Studies. So thank you very much, Emelia. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you everyone for coming. It's both nice and a little bit more intimidating to see so many people I recognize as names on the Zoom screen. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, so hopefully everyone can see that clearly. I'm just going to minimize you guys. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be part of this series. I'm really looking forward to the talks to come, and I'm so pleased that we've able to kind of bring together such an interdisciplinary array of talks. But today I'll be talking, as Sylvia said, about my book, Reading Veganism, The Monstrous Vegan 1818 to Present, which was published with Oxford University Press in November of last year. So in what follows, I hope to give an overview of the book as a whole. So I'm first going to outline the kind of vegan theoretical parameters I employ. I'll then elaborate on what I mean by the monstrous vegan as a literary trope, and I'll provide some historical examples. But first, to give a kind of brief summary of the aims of the book. So Reading Veganism addresses a lacuna in critical scholarship regarding what it means to live, enact, or perform a vegan identity. And I seek also to establish what it means to take a vegan theoretical approach to the study of literature. So to do this, I offer a series of rereadings of canonical texts, explicating their overlooked potential as sources for thinking about vegan modes of life. So this book emerges from my PhD research, which had originally begun as a project to chart a literary history of cheese. And it was only when I really started working on the project and the books I was working on, I started to notice the continual reoccurrence of these monsters who were refusing to eat meat. And that led me to shift the focus to think about what these figures were doing, right? To work out what they were doing in these various guises across literary history and why they always seemed to inspire such an seemingly inexplicable anxiety in those who encountered them. So considering novels from the Romantic period through to the contemporary, the book works to identify a distinct literary trope of the monstrous vegan, and tracking this figure across 2 centuries of Anglophone literature. The book explores the origins and mutations of vegan monstrosity across a range of national and historical contexts, starting with the 1818 is referring to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So the principal contention of the book is that understandings of veganism as an identity and a practice are limited without a consideration of multiplicity, provisionality, failure, and insufficiency within vegan definition and lived practice. So the book therefore advances 2, I guess, slightly distinct aims. First, establishing the perhaps surprising recurrence of vegan monsters across the literary canon. And second, arguing for the necessity of embracing the monstrous as a way of reconceiving of vegan identity. The monsters are seen to offer an important and useful rehearsal of the key paradoxes that are involved in the writing of vegan identity. So I thought first I'd provide a brief outline of how I work to theorize veganism. So first, on the level of definition, I ground my definition of veganism in the combination of belief and action that seeks the end of the exploitative use of non-human animals for human benefit. So veganism is, of course, adopted for a range of different motives, right? Ethical, environmental, health, and economic grounds, and functions in different ways for different people. But for me, recognition of the suffering of non-human animals is central to the definition of vegan practice, with the desire to end such suffering, the kernel of utopian desire undergirding veganism. So despite the mass rise in veganism in recent decades, particularly in the West, and its increasing centrality to broader debates about anthropogenic climate change, a nuanced interrogation of veganism as activism and lived practice has been limited within existing humanities scholarship. And partly the reason for this neglect is due to what I consider to be kind of the misconception that it's a distinctly modern or contemporary phenomenon. And so, as many of you will know, the kind of number of historical studies that have been released over the past few decades, that I've put some on the slide there, provide a wide range of evidence that traces the existence of vegetarian and vegan philosophy and practice all the way back to kind of prehistoric human civilization. And such studies are therefore important in dissociating such identities and dietary practices from the merely faddish. But these books do tend to position veganism kind of right at the end as something that only really existed in the mid-20th century. And so what I try and do in my book is investigate the various ways in which veganism has functioned through literature and across history beyond the past few decades. The risk, of course, is therefore that my book uses veganism in an anachronistic way, that veganism was only coined in 1944, makes it perhaps difficult to justify using as a term to talk about historical texts such as Frankenstein, published over a century earlier in 1818, or 2 centuries really. So I want to talk first in more detail about how I'm defining veganism in order to explain why I find it useful to use in this potentially anachronistic way. So the coinage of vegan in 1944 means that we can trace the term's etymology very precisely. So originating with the founder of the Vegan Society, vegan was invented as a term that employed the first and last letters of the word vegetarian, with the word vegetarian already a common term in use since at least 1842. So the choice of the term vegan was explained by Watson as marking the beginning and end of vegetarian. So veganism appears here as a utopian vision of the ends of vegetarianism, both as a kind of truncated linguistic form and also an inevitable ethical endpoint. So this still raises the question of why veganism or vegan analysis differs from vegetarianism and why this distinction matters. So in terms of definition, the Vegetarian Society offers the following definition of vegetarianism. A vegetarian is someone who lives on a diet of grains, pulses, legumes, nuts, seeds, vegetables, fruit, fungi, algae, yeast, and/or some other non-animal-based foods with or without dairy products, honey, and/or eggs. A vegetarian does not eat foods that consist of or have been produced with the aid of products consisting of or created from any part of the body of a living or dead animal. This includes meat, poultry, fish, shellfish, insects, byproducts of slaughter, or any food made with processing aids created from these. So the focus in this definition is on the act of eating non-human animal bodies, and can be criticized for various reasons, but it might be criticized for its neglect of the ethics involved in the wearing of such bodies, as with leather and fur. But what I want to note for my purposes here is that this definition is only about what one puts in one's mouth. And so the focus on non-ingestion of animals aspires to a clear demarcation of the vegetarian as a recognizable and achievable and a stable identity. So within the terms of such definition, if you don't eat meat, you are a vegetarian. And I want to put this in contrast then with the definition offered by the UK Vegan Society on veganism. So a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of humans, animals, and the environment. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partly from animals. So obviously the ethical limits of veganism appear here with certainty of all forms and products, but the definition frames veganism as a philosophy and way of living within the hyphenated clause, as far as is possible and practicable. So thus, while striving towards the end of all forms of exploitation, veganism, at the level even of its kind of official definition, appears tethered to the burdens of its impossibly inclusive aspirations, reliant on a recognition of that which is neither possible nor practicable. So the Vegan Society's definition captures the inevitability of veganism's only partially realized ideal, inferring both an absence of viable alternatives and infrastructures and the inevitability of exploitative relations. And obviously the reality is that if one would really have to kind of absent oneself from the world altogether to be 100% vegan. If we're to think about secondary and tertiary levels of exploitation, we risk a descent into an endless abyss of abstention. And so possessing a body that must inevitably ingest, trample, or uproot animals through everyday actions, or displace and endanger through participation in global capitalism, suggests an ethical impasse that must be continually addressed. And so it's this sense of impossibility, insufficiency, and failure that for me is the most important distinction from vegetarianism. Veganism is here much more than what we put in our mouths, and does not, despite what many, I guess, stereotypes in the mainstream imagination might say, provide any easy, stable, or fixed answer to the problems of modern living. It enacts a utopian striving towards a better world, but one that must grapple daily with its impossibilities. So the impossibility of achieving a stable or secure vegan identity exemplifies the dilemma facing postmodern identity politics more broadly. So the queer theorist Tim Dean, for example, critiques identification politics as a mode of subjectivity that, through identification with an ideal image, fails to result in a solid or fixed identity. Dean argues that the very possibility of identification with an ideal image implies a gap between the one who identifies and the ideal. This implicit gap brings the discomfort of subjective guilt or bad conscience, where we identify with an ideal image only to be plagued by a nagging sense of failing to live up to the ideal. Similarly, as Judith Butler famously argues, speaking in the context of gender and queerness, unnecessary violence is enacted by identity categories in their attempt to totalize the individual. However, for Butler, this does not invalidate the importance or necessity of identity categories as a means through which to subvert and reinvent political discourse. Butler notes, for instance, that the temporary totalization performed by identity categories is a necessary error. And if identity is a necessary error, then the assertion of queer will be necessary as a term of affiliation, even if one must acknowledge that it will not fully describe those it purports to represent. So in short, identity categories, while delimiting and restricting identity, serve an important function in terms of community affiliation and recognition. So as we saw in the Vegan Society's definition, identification as a vegan is explicitly haunted by what Dean terms an implicit guilt or bad conscience. Veganism is defined by finding oneself always unable to meet the all-inclusive scope of its ethical aspirations. And this active acknowledgement of contradictions and inconsistencies embedded within vegan practice therefore invites a recognition of veganism's complicity and collusion with dominant systems of oppression. So this acknowledgement runs counter to many mainstream preconceptions of veganism that I mentioned before, where it's frequently associated with moral righteousness or the vegan police. And so my work within vegan theory interrogates such assumptions and stereotypes and explores what monstrosity has to offer to conceptions of vegan identity. Ultimately, I argue that veganism might best be conceptualized as a state of strategic insufficiency and queering of normative humanity, in which a sense of failure and complicity coexists with utopian gestures and ethical commitments. So it's my definition of veganism as a state of strategic insufficiency that draws me towards queer theory, where ideas about failure and negativity have been previously thought through in really productive ways. So Jack Halberstam's 2011 book on the far left there, Queer Art of Failure, looks at the potential rewards of failure for queer theory. The alignment of queerness and veganism might appear on the surface as a problematic conflation of two distinct notions of identity and histories of oppression. And yet, as has been well documented in work such as Carol J. Adams's, heterosexual masculinity and human subjectivity have long relied on the assumption of compulsory carnivorism. In this line of thinking, veganism can be seen as engaged in critiquing many of the same institutions as queer theory, challenging heteronormative ideas about what it means to be a sexed, gendered, and ultimately speciesed subject. Veganism, like queer theory, also seeks to expand possibilities for kinship beyond traditional structures, extending here to non-human animals. Veganism can also be seen to unsettle our construction of the human as based on a binary contrast with and consumption of the animal. In a recent article, Dana Luciano and Mel White Chen argue that the foundational texts of queer theory also fundamentally interrogate and unsettle the concept of the human. So while the human has undoubtedly been prioritized by many queer theorists, they argue that, to quote, queer theory has long been suspicious of the politics of rehabilitation and inclusion to which liberal humanist values lead, because full humanity has never been the only horizon for queer becoming. Work on kind of queer positivity that we see with Jone Munoz also has much to offer veganism. So Munoz's Cruising Utopia argues of the queer utopian potentialities embedded within the present. For Munoz, to quote, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. He seeks, therefore, instances within the present, even if an oppressive and untenable present, that burn with what he terms utopian potentiality, the possibility of a different, better state that occurs within the present, rather than as something promised into the future. And so my interest in what it means to occupy a vegan identity in the present has much to learn from queer optimism and the question of how one survives the present. So veganism's resistance to normative humanity responsible for the systemic abuse of non-human animals requires an acknowledgement of the coexistence of failure, inconsistency, and complicity with hope and utopianism. And as the scholar Joshua Schuster asserts, vegans must find a way to form a speculative life that bridges this world with a future world of animal justice. For Schuster, as for me, the inevitability of violence and the impossibility of a fully vegan world is, to quote, no reason to relent on a desire for utopian ways of living together. So this is why I use the term vegan to refer to several of the monsters in my study who might otherwise more appropriately be labeled as vegetarians, because these monsters are seen to embody this grappling with difficulty and failure that I posit as at the heart of a vegan state of being. So if that explains the risk of anachronism, a further critique of this project might be that in this focus on what it means to occupy a vegan identity, and by exclusively focusing on literary representations of vegans, even if monstrous ones, one is at risk of sidelining the non-human animals to whom veganism is purportedly extending its concern. And this is a risk that mirrors in many ways Jacques Derrida's work on the non-human animal, and that he suggests this risk is inextricably tied to vegetarianism and by extension, veganism. So in his posthumously published The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida posits ethics as a process of continual questioning and inquiry into the unknown, rather than as something that can be fixed or decided in advance. Derrida references Jeremy Bentham's much quoted footnote that asserts that it's not whether animals can think, reason, or speak that should dictate our sense of ethical responsibility, but whether they can suffer. And Derrida suggests the question of suffering is pertinent because suffering, to quote, is disturbed by a certain passivity. It bears witness, manifesting already as question, the response that testifies to a sufferance, a passion, a not being able. A shared vulnerability, mortality, or as Derrida terms it, finitude with non-human animals is seen as an inability or radical non-power in which true morality resides. By contrast, ascribing a label and proscription to ethical action, such as vegetarianism, is seen to negate individual responses and the significance of an aporia of judgment. So as Carrie Weil neatly summarizes, the incalculable or undecidable are central to Derrida's notion of ethics because, to quote, otherwise ethics would not be a response at all, but the application of a rule or mathematical equation. It would be more of a reaction than a response, and hence an opting out of responsibility. So in his 1991 interview with Jean-Luc Nancy, Eating Well, Derrida distinguishes an excess of responsibility from the rational becoming right associated with morality. So as you see in the quote here, responsibility is excessive or it is not a responsibility. A limited, measured, calculable, rationally distributed responsibility is already the becoming right of morality. It is at times also, in the best hypothesis, the dream of every good conscience, in the worst hypothesis of the petty or grand inquisitors. Derrida argues in this same essay of vegetarianism's illusory sense of freedom from complicity, an illusion that masks an inevitable participation in the continuation of that which he terms carnophilogocentrism, a term that names the white male and carnivorous subject of Western culture and binds the question of subjectivity to the question of sacrifice, whether of the racialized, gendered, or non-human other. There's no T in that. Okay, so in short, Derrida thinks vegetarianism negates an actual ethical response to animals and grants only an illusion of good conscience. So here, taking on the identity of vegetarian or vegan associated with rigid prescriptions decided in advance is seen to negate the possibility of a truly ethical response to the actual suffering of an individual animal. So where does that leave us as vegans? There have been several kind of vegetarian or vegan-oriented refutations of Derrida's dismissal that are worth noting. So moral philosopher Gary Steiner argues that the reality of modern veganism is not a state of good conscience, but an identity that is experienced as a gnawing horror, born of a recognition of what is being done to billions of animals right now and of the seeming futility of one's decision. So Steiner suggests that veganism operates not as a foreclosed, pre-decided ethics, as per Derrida, but as an openness to the torment of the reality that modernity seeks to shield us from. David Wood also critiques Derrida's attack on vegetarianism and argues that it is not a closed set of prescriptions, but might better be understood as, to quote, a willingness and capacity to respond, hence an indeterminable openness. Along similar lines, I would argue that veganism represents a state of continual questioning and ethical decision-making, decisions that have to be made and negotiated every day. As the scholar James Stanescu argues, it might be better not to talk about veganism at all, but to talk only of becoming vegan as a continual and never-ending process. So building on these ideas, while my analysis of monstrous vegans in literature risks perpetuating the logic of an anthropocentric culture by overlooking the lived reality of non-human animals, I argue that we might utilize this detachment as a productive position from which to critically evaluate our relationships. The non-human animals whose oppression we are witnessing are not and cannot be the subjects of aesthetic and political discourse. We can only ever speak for and on behalf of the non-human. And this fact is something that literary texts, by their very nature as written documents, emphasize. So I'm interested in, therefore, what literary texts can teach us about the ways in which veganism grapples with impossibility and failure, and what it means to occupy an identity that functions as this form of continual striving towards a necessarily unattainable utopian vision. Recognition of this distance from the animal also enables the active performance of such impossibilities, and this is something that I use in later chapters of the book to suggest the various ways in which we might perform or offer kind of camp renditions of the monstrous vegan. So yeah, that's the kind of theoretical terms of the book that I hope makes some sense. And I'm going to turn now to an overview of how this applies in literature. So in the book, I trace the figure of what I label as the monstrous vegan across the past 2 centuries of Anglophone literature, and I identify this trope in relation to 4 key characteristics. So, you know, if a figure in a book has these characteristics, they would be what I define as the monstrous vegan. So first, monstrous vegans do not eat animals, an abstinence that generates a seemingly inexplicable anxiety in those who encounter them. Second, they are hybrid assemblages of human and non-human animal parts, destabilizing species boundaries. Third, monstrous vegans are outside of heterosexual reproduction, the products of male acts of creation. And finally, monstrous vegans are intimately connected to acts of writing and literary creation. So as already mentioned, I traced the origins of this figure back to Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein. So for some context, for those who aren't familiar, Mary Shelley and her husband Percy followed for the majority of their lives vegetarian and vegan dietary practices, and were very much part of an active emergent vegetarian communities. The long 19th century more broadly saw the development of a discursively legible vegetarian identity. So while not appearing as a term in print until 1842, the popularity of vegetarian diets in Britain had been growing since the late 18th century. While veganism was not a term coined until over a century later, the adoption of what would now be considered predominantly vegan diets, lifestyles, and consumer choices were also increasingly practiced. So Carol J. Adams's foundational work in the sexual politics of meat establishes in clear and compelling terms the vegetarian politics that lie at the heart of Frankenstein. I assume before I kind of go on that most of you are familiar with Frankenstein as a kind of global cultural myth, but I thought I'd just very briefly summarize the plot of the original novel for those who are perhaps a little rustier on it. So, framed by letters sent by the explorer Walton to his sister Margaret Saville while on an expedition to discover the Northwest Passage, the narrative of Frankenstein tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, a stranger picked up by Walton's ship in the middle of the Arctic. Victor recounts his life story to Walton, describing his upbringing and childhood in idyllic terms, a stark contrast to his increasingly fervent and ill-fated interest in the natural sciences. This scientific interest is pursued during his time at university, culminating in the creation of his now infamous monster. Instantly rejecting that which he has made, Victor undergoes a period of convalescence and his monster disappears seemingly without a trace. The middle section of the novel provides then details of the creature's experiences during this absence, told as part of his attempt to convince Victor to create for him a female mate as hideous as himself. Learning to read and write while living in a hovel attached to the De Lacy family home, the creature's tale is a sympathetic account of how he is initiated into the ways of humankind and finds himself longing for companionship. However, after finding himself spurned by human society due to his monstrous physicality, he embarks upon a quest of revenge against his maker, murdering Victor's infant brother William, his close friend Henry Clerval, and his wife Elizabeth, as well as framing the servant girl Justine for William's murder, leading to her execution. So chapter 1 of my book reads Victor Frankenstein's creation as a foundational monstrous vegan figure, establishing the blueprint for the monstrous vegan trope that comes to crystallize over the preceding 200 years of Anglophone literature. So firstly, the creature does not eat meat. After fleeing from Victor Frankenstein's laboratory, the creature sustains himself on nuts, acorns, roots, cheese, and bread, and argues of his essentially peaceful and benevolent nature in the following terms. My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. This vegan diet of acorns and berries associates the monster with a prelapsarian Eden and alludes to ideas that were popular at the time of a vegetarian golden age that was suggested to have come before the fall of man. So the creature begs of Victor to make him a female mate and dreams of an exile in South America together, where the sun will shine on us as on man and will ripen our food. So this evocation of a world before the advent of fire ties into the Promethean metaphors throughout the novel. And it's worth noting here that the subtitle given to the novel by Shelley was Frankenstein, a Modern Prometheus. So the myth of Prometheus is a kind of Greek myth whereby Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. For Percy Shelley, Mary's husband and obviously famous poet, the gift of fire to humanity was the origin of our fall from grace. So in his extensive notes to his early radical poem, Queen Mab, Percy posited fire as the advent of meat eating because it enabled meat to be palatable to humans. So to quote Percy, Prometheus, who represents the human race, effected some great change in the condition of his nature and applied fire to culinary purposes, thus inventing an expedient for screening from his disgust the horrors of the shambles. Percy then goes on to suggest that this use of fire was the root cause of all evil in the world, and posits the rejection of both meat and alcohol as a solution to variously disease, crime, mental and bodily derangement, the vice of commerce and avarice of commercial monopoly, the desire of tyranny, class inequality, unsustainable land use, food waste, and national security, amongst many other social ills. So with this context in mind, the creature's fireless vision of the future of berries ripened by the sun comes to signal a cyclical return to a kind of pre-Promethean vegetarian Eden and inscribes vegetarianism onto the body as the original corporeal state of mankind. So as the second distinguishing trait of the monstrous vegan, Frankenstein's monster is physically composed of both human and animal parts. Victor assembles him from parts pilfered from both the charnel house and the slaughterhouse. Jackson Petch argues that, quote, by virtue of his very makeup, the creature destabilizes the anthropocentric human-animal binary, and implicit fears of miscegenation and cannibalism combine in the novel with fears of bestiality and of becoming animal. Thirdly, the creature is born outside of heterosexual reproduction, and his anomalous creation distinguishes him from traditional origin narratives. Victor's experiment, as many have commented, sees him usurp the female reproductive role, and the narrative itself charts the death of multiple mother figures in a kind of narrative world populated primarily by motherless men. So the reproductive status of the monstrous vegan has various significations throughout the history of the monstrous vegan as I trace it, and ties into questions about the association of veganism with childish and sentimental love of animals, threats that veganism is seen to pose to normative understandings of a mature kind of meat-eating state of adulthood, veganism's threat to the reproduction of the social order as it stands, and veganism's relationship to patriarchal discourses that seek to contain and control the biological body. It's also interesting to compare the association of the monstrous vegan with the usurpation of a reproductive role with a challenge to discourses of reproductive futurity to a common theme in modern derogations of veganism, so very contemporary derogations of veganism. So Laura Wright has noted, for example, the obsession in mainstream media with the mortality of children born to vegan parents, and draws attention to a number of news stories focusing on the death of children through neglect that depict, to quote, veganism as a menacing danger inflicted by negligent, uninformed parents, primarily mothers, on their children. In Frankenstein, the patriarchal origins of the vegan monster are also intimately connected to the status of writing and the written word. And so this fourth trait of the monstrous vegan, the creature's relation to the literary, establishes a primary contention of my book, and that is that monstrous vegans bring to the fore the difficulties of communications of selfhood outside of a predetermined socio-symbolic order. So the novel makes numerous intertextual allusions to the vegetarian discourses found in other literary texts, so from Ovid's Metamorphoses to Milton's Paradise Lost, and that the creature's vegetarianism comes to be articulated via other literary sources, disrupts any straightforward attribution of his body as biologically herbivorous. So as I already noted, the 19th century saw a growth in vegetarian ideals, and the late 18th century saw much writing published promoting return to a natural, i.e. meatless diet. So for Carol Adams, acknowledging this long neglected vegetarian aspect of Frankenstein is a means of understanding better Shelley's feminist politics. So Adams argues that Frankenstein explicitly brings together radicalism, feminism, and vegetarianism, and draws attention to the narrative's engagement with contemporaneous vegetarian tracks. So Adams argues that recognizing and drawing attention to the forgotten vegetarian context influencing Shelley is a way to, quote, preserve the integrity of the original text. And this is done through the recovery of what she calls vegetarian words. So for Adams, vegetarianism in literature is a feminist concern that is inextricably related to the literal. So she argues, to quote, that when women writers include vegetarianism in a novel, it will represent the complex layering of respect for the literal. So a text that bears the vegetarian word in Adams's terms allows for the faithful transmission of the words and diets of previous vegetarians. So scholarship that has ignored these vegetarian contexts and messages has therefore been guilty for Adams of a form of dismemberment structurally akin to the dismemberment of animals. So to quote Adams at greater length, the signature of a vegetarian in a vegetarian text is the signature of someone trying to write on the reader, leave a mark on the reader's own personal text of meat. It's an attempt to make their words flesh and to stop the story of meat. In their expectation of a literal response, they seek no more dismembered texts, dismembered animals, but instead hope for a remembered text that protects the literal living animals. So this quote really is key to the argument I go on to advance in my book as a whole, where I really seek to challenge and complicate this sense of both literature and vegetarian discourses as fixed and transmitted whole. Because while it provides a helpful metaphor for thinking about the literal animals obscured by metaphor, literary meaning is much more slippery than suggested here and doesn't always flow so neatly from book to reader. So as vegan literary studies emerges as an academic discipline, we are required to ask how, if at all, we are to remain open to the myriad possibilities of texts and their monstrous mutations of meaning, if we are seeking an advance to either remember the non-human animal, the literal behind the symbolic, or to extract a distinct and preordained vegan message or ethics. So this issue could be boiled down to the question of how do we reconcile the desire to be a good literary scholar with the desire to be a good vegan, right? That they have slightly competing claims. So central to the project overall, as I mentioned at the start, is to demonstrate how veganism is itself monstrous. So the monster, more broadly, is a seemingly inescapable social convention and source of fear, superstition, and awe throughout human history. Monsters are disruptive to human attempts to assert order and control over the world and frequently exist at the borders of human and non-human animal definition. For Carrie Wolf, monsters represent disorder, confusion of identity, social havoc. For Marcus Bowman and Sean Morland, monsters are figures that always escape human comprehension. They demonstrate what we do not know and remonstrate against our presumption to know. For Jack Halberstam, writing on the Gothic novel, the monster offers an infinitely interpretable body, functioning as monster when it is able to condense as many fear-producing traits as possible into one body. So the production of fear is seen to emanate from a vertiginous excess of meaning, where multiple interpretations are embedded in the text and part of the experience of horror comes from the realization that meaning itself runs riot. So here the idea of the monster is linked to an errancy of meaning, to that which escapes our desire for neat and ordered boundaries. So the multiple layers of text and readers found in Frankenstein the novel complicate Adams's claims that Shelley, quote, presumes a continuous relationship between text and reader, in which the text, protected, left whole, will have an effect on the reader who greets the words literally. Right? I'm kind of complicating this idea of this continuous relationship between text and reader. For one, it's important to note that the monster's declaration of that my food is not that of man does not appear in the text as an unmediated assertion, but appears via Walton's letters to his sister, which he then recounts, Victor recounting the monster story in this kind of endlessly deferred rearticulation. The dangers of forgery and error in literary transmission are also highlighted at various points in the novel, with translated and copied letters appearing in each of the narrative's concentric circles, drawing attention to the slipperiness of the written word in the novel as an unreliable means of transmitting meaning. So I argue that vegetarianism thus appears in the novel as a multiply mediated discursive expression, and the original prelapsarian vegetarian body exists only as a mythic construction at the center of multiple narrations and is at risk of mistranslation and errors in transcription. So on the slide here, you can see Mary Shelley's iconic reference in the 1831 preface to a new edition of Frankenstein to the novel as her hideous progeny, positioning herself as Frankensteinian creator. And Victor, too, in the novel refers to the version of his narrative as relayed and recounted by Walton as at risk of mutilation. And so here, acts of writing are implicitly connected to monster making, to making monsters that cannot be contained, that escape from one's control. Frankenstein's reflections on acts of literary creation intersect with the novel's representation of vegetarianism in several ways. As the natural man before discourse, the creature's vegetarianism is presented as a corporeal disposition. However, this bodily vegetarianism nonetheless invests in the Promethean visions of a vegetarian golden age, as derived from late 18th and early 19th century writings, as we saw in Percy Shelley's work. Furthermore, the creature's vegetarianism, while enacted initially through his choice of plant-based fare, later becomes articulated through pre-existing discourses. So Adams argues that the creature's assertion of an alternative mythos of origins based on inclusion and communion with the non-human is a feminist rebellion enacted through a rejection of the patriarchal language of meat. However, the Miltonic influence that pervades the novel complicates Adams's assertion here, particularly when we consider the influence of Paradise Lost on the creature himself. So the creature describes reading Paradise Lost as, to quote, a true history, and relates several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. So that the creature's vegetarianism mirrors that of Milton's Adam and Eve before their fall from grace, suggests that what Adams reads as the creature's vegetarian feminist rebellion could also be read simply as an iteration of the language of Milton's patriarchal mythos of origins. So rather than assertion of rebellion, his vegetarianism could paradoxically be seen as a means of recognizing and securing himself within an existing patriarchal narrative of human origins, right, that is traced back through Percy and through others. So I therefore argue that the creature whose choice of words see him explicitly mirror and rehearse the words of early 19th century vegetarian texts comes to function as embodiment of these vegetarian tracts and the risks associated with the written word, i.e. idealistic utopian and pacifist ideals contained within the hideous deformed body of the literary, or the literary here as a realm of monstrous excess that fails in its attempt to control or contain the errancy of the corporeal body. And so this, I think, is of particular interest for vegans today, because veganism is often an awkward fit on the corporeal body, creating a monstrous sense of self that is composed of a hybrid form of prior discursive reference that do not always match up neatly with individual alimentary or aesthetic pleasures. As Laura Wright notes, veganism is a delicate mixture of something both primal and social. So to give a summary of the argument here, the Monstrous Vegan originates in Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein's creature generates anxieties about what it means to define oneself as human. The Gothic doubling throughout Shelley's novel combined with the monstrous hybrid human-animal form and rejection of meat eating to provoke anxieties about gendered, raced, and species identities. Shelley relies on romantic vegetarian arguments about the relation between meat eating and a Promethean fall from grace. And this rehearsal of ideas about a vegetarian golden age posits an ambivalence at the heart of her narrative, in which the creature's meat-free dream of exile appears as both biological disposition and discursive imposition. So counter to Adams, I argue that Shelley's text does not simply transform the vegetarian ethics of the time into narrative form that can be literally transmitted, but presents a creature that hints at the ambivalence, contradictions, and anxieties that cluster around such ethics. Okay, so what kind of, this is then the structure of the remainder of the book. So throughout the rest of part one, I identify the monstrous vegan trope as it recurs across the literary canon and crystallizes as a literary myth. So I'll just give an extremely brief overview of these chapters. So chapter 2 explores the work of H.G. Wells and his conflation of alimentary and sexual appetite. So Wells is The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1896 science fiction novella, is an explicit rewriting of Frankenstein that depicts abstinence from meat as a repressive mode of humanist discipline and restriction. And I tie this into the intersections of sexuality and meat eating throughout his vast oeuvre, in which vegetarianism is repeatedly associated with kind of lesbianism and frigidity. So the eponymous Dr. Moreau carries out painful acts of vivisection in his attempts to transform wild animals into human beings. And rather than the Edenic vision of humankind's vegetarian origins that we find in Frankenstein, the hybrid human-animal creatures of Dr. Moreau, referred to in the novel as the beast people, must continually recite Moreau's law in order to keep their vegetarianism in check. And this vegetarianism is a way to subdue and control them until at the end they become kind of feral. So the beast people repeatedly chant together, not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men? And they describe their kind of diet of man's food as a mixture of herbs, roots, and fruit. And so in this chapter, I trace how the monstrous vegetarianism of Frankenstein gets transposed onto the beast people as a repressive discursive code that seeks to repress their seemingly innate carnivorous desires. Then in chapter 3, I turn to Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, published between 2003 and 2013. And I established the ways in which Atwood's vegan monsters are self-consciously presented as overdetermined literary constructions. So unpacking allusions to a wide body of vegetarian and vegan philosophy and thought within the text, this chapter rethinks ideas about narrative transmission and the reproduction of literary veganisms. Atwood's novels are seen to raise attention to the dangers of transmitting vegan messages. So Atwood explicitly rewrites the monstrous vegan figures of both Shelley and Wells. So we have the Quakers, who are genetically modified post-human creatures who resemble Frankenstein's creature. And then we have an eco-religious cult called the God's Gardeners, who continually recite their veggie vows, that comes to be a kind of satirical mirror of the disciplinary codes enforced on Moreau's beast people in Wells's novel. So taking a satirical approach to such monstrous vegans, Atwood's trilogy castigates veganism as a discursive code that functions as only a superficial illusion of innocence and non-complicity. And monstrous vegans expose the violent male desires behind such projections of a pure vegan body. Okay, so yeah, if part 1 is kind of tracking the monstrous vegan across 2 centuries of Anglophone literature, it explores the kind of origins and then also the mutations of vegan monstrosity across a range of national and historical contexts. So I think it's important here that I'm not looking at books that are pro-vegan texts or that are even explicitly about veganism, but I'm seeking to trace the narrative possibilities of veganism in these works. So I ask here why and in what ways the vegan appears in a monstrous guise across 200 years of literary history. And I ask what a better understanding of vegan monsters, their contexts and literary afterlives mean for modern conceptions of veganism, and how such understanding helps to reimagine veganism as identity and practice. So the works of Shelley, Wells, and Atwood are seen as this kind of trajectory where each one is kind of rewriting the other and consciously alluding back. And Atwood's trilogy therefore provides a kind of apt culmination of the trajectory, providing a deconstruction of the textual legacies of veganism that came before it. But in Atwood, we find very little redemption offered by this deconstruction, that she engages the monstrous vegan trope only in order to dismiss veganism as an illusory projection of innocence. And so in part 2 of the book, I seek to understand what we might gain from embracing the monstrous vegan. And so I examine 2 contemporary iterations of the monstrous vegan trope that, in contrast to Atwood, seem to rehabilitate the monstrous vegan and establish more reparative modes for confronting systemic violence against the non-human. So looking at the work of Jem Coetzee and Ellen Hollinghurst, I posit both authors first as writing within this kind of extant vegan canon and expand in the process the concept of the monstrous vegan beyond its confines in Gothic and science fiction traditions. And the ways in which both Coetzee and Hollinghurst engage with the trope of the monstrous vegan gestures towards the possibility of performing monstrous veganism or enacting it as a mode of camp excess. So the monstrous vegan functions here in a way structurally akin to Judith Butler's sense of gender identity as something that can be occupied rather than as an essential or stable core. So this offers the embrace of monstrosity as an alternative survival response for individual vegans, reclaiming the denigrated figure of the monstrous vegan for the vegan community and acknowledging vegan complicity through an embrace of elements such as joy, pleasure, and play. Part 2 is about rehabilitating the monstrous vegan, and I suggest that in these novels, reading for vegan monsters provide alternative means of gaining knowledge beyond the paranoid reading of and an often debilitating focus on the immensity of global animal suffering. And I conclude, therefore, with the proposal that if veganism and its manifestation in the monstrous vegan trope exists as a literary and discursive trope inscribed onto bodies, then it can also be consciously inhabited as an excessive and parodic performance. Okay, so to conclude overall, in order for veganism to maintain its efficacy as a mode of engagement with and response to the non-human world, I argue that it must remain fragmentary and hybrid, akin to the monstrous vegan creations examined throughout my book. If reading for veganism requires its misrecognition as a coherent and stable practice and identity, it's nonetheless important to complicate Adams's desire to preserve the integrity of an original text. The monstrous vegan is a trope that we can trace across the past 200 years of Anglophone literary history. An evaluation of the monstrous vegan trope in the canonical texts of Shelley and Wells, for instance, demonstrates the surprisingly long history of literary representations of vegans as monstrous and anxiety-inducing. And once identified, we can trace it and reappearing in multiple guises. But the monstrous vegan is more than simply an interesting facet of literary history and is important in several ways. First, it helps to unravel what exactly it is about veganism that makes it a locus of fear and anxiety. Second, vegan monsters rehearse the key paradoxes involved in the writing of vegan identity. The analysis of monstrous vegan figures offers a way of reconceptualizing veganism in the present moment, a way of thinking through the complex coming together of utopianism and insufficiency that I argued at the start inhere in vegan modes of being in the world. And third, if monster functions as an injurious term, I argue that the monstrous vegan nonetheless confers a productive social identity upon individual vegans. Butler describes how, called by an injurious name, I come into social being because I have a certain inevitable attachment to my existence, because a certain narcissism takes hold of any term that confers existence. I am led to embrace the terms that injure me because they constitute me socially. So in the latter half of my book, I draw out the possibilities accorded by an embrace of monstrous veganism in the service of social legibility, exploring the ways in which the monstrous vegan trope has been recuperated in works of contemporary fiction. It's a hybrid and contradictory figure that allows for complexity, inconsistency, and insufficiency to coexist alongside a queer and utopian investment in what it might mean to understand one's sense of being human otherwise. Thank you.